couple of years ago, while I was sitting in my database design class, the lecturer was speaking about religion. And it came up the topic about Saul's conversion. He couldn't understand and he couldn't believe how Saul's conversion took place. It didn't make sense to him. It wasn't logical to him. And today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about Saul's conversion. Within his conversion, it shows the beauty of Christianity. It shows the old man and it shows the new man. At the time, I knew nothing about apologetics. I knew there was an answer to it, but I didn't know what the answer was or even how to speak about that answer. So from Acts chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "Then Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues to Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he may bring them bound to Jerusalem." So Damascus was it was the second main city to Jerusalem. So he was saying, listen, I want permission from you, the high priest, that if I see anyone preaching about the way, talking about the way, I want to bring them chained to Jerusalem to face the council. So I want us to get an image of who Saul was. Saul was a Pharisee. He was strict and rigid according to the law, and he was a persecutor of the church. But I want you to look at it from his perspective, right? Because from a Christian perspective, we look at him as a persecutor. From his perspective at the time, the early Christians were the one who were spreading a false message, spreading blasphemy among the people. So in his mind, he was doing the right thing by persecuting them. And he was very zealous in his persecution. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Now in his recount in chapter 26, it says that the voice spoke to him in the Hebrew language. Now that triggered something for Saul. It was speaking to him not in Greek, not in any other language, but in the language of his ancestors, in the Hebrew language. And then he said immediately, "Who are you, Lord?" Then the Lord said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads." Before Christians were called Christians, they were called followers of the way. For the person driving an ox, they would have a sharp stick, and they would use that to drive it forward, to drive the animal forward. Sometimes the animal wouldn't like that, and they would kick against that sharp stick, and it would end up piercing them even deeper, and then it essentially inflicts more harm on the animal. And I believe Jesus was telling him here, by what you're doing, it's like you're that ox. I don't know if it's within his conscience, he knew that something was wrong, but he was pushing back against his own conscience because of the strictness and the rigidity of what he believed to be the right way of God, right? That, oral tradition, the Pharisaic tradition. I don't know if that's what Christ had meant at that time, but he was fearful and astonished. So he, trembled and astonished, said, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" So immediately he understood what God meant. Stop fighting against me. Stop kicking against me. Stop persecuting those of the way. So he said, "Well, what do I do, Lord?" Then the Lord said to him, "Arise and go into the city, and you will be told what to do." And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, but when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. So he was struck with blindness. And I believe this blindness was almost like a parable for his own spiritual blindness. His physical blindness acted as an analogy for his spiritual blindness. And they led him by hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. So with one experience of Christ, Paul went from a zealous Pharisee to being on his knees and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? And in short time, just a couple years later, Paul started to preach Christ in the synagogues. And everyone was fearful because they were confused. So Christians were fearful that this Paul all of a sudden following the way. And then those priests were confused. It's like, isn't this the same Paul who used to drag people in with chains into the prisons, who was following the way? Paul confused people. And just like Paul confused people back then, I believe he confused that lecturer, because deep down we have a hard time understanding the being born again, the change in character that comes with following Christ. Now, not everyone, that change in character is going to be immediate like Paul. Paul had a specific mandate. He was chosen by God to go speak to the Gentiles, to carry the good news to the Gentile kingdoms. The good news of salvation and forgiveness of sin. But every single one of us who embarks on a journey of following Christ, of following God, of following the Messiah, we go through a transformation. We go through a sanctification. We go through a process of the old things become dull and unappealing to us, and behold, all things are new. That's what we go through as Christians. And it may seem weird to the outside. It may seem weird. Some may say, this person was a party goer. This person used to curse and drink and be, in fights and gangs and all of these things. But when we get to know Christ, and we know Christ crucified, and we know we have forgiveness of sins, and it's not because of what we do, but it's because of grace. We can't earn salvation. It's because of grace. We don't earn our way into heaven. Now, salvation, I think, is a little bit different from sanctification, what I was talking about earlier. Now, sanctification is that process whereby we become righteous, whereby we live, and the things that, think of it in a way of a refining process, of removing the impurities from gold, for instance, so that it becomes pure. That's how I think of sanctification. And in my own life, I see sanctification looking back at me from 10 years ago to the me that is now. There's still plenty of things that the Lord is dealing with in my life. There's still pride issues. There's still so much things that the Lord is dealing with. But looking back at the person that I was before, the person who maybe used to curse, the person who used to look at things that was not of any sort of substance and benefit, who was consumed by lust, who was consumed by anger, who maybe used to act without thinking. I thank the Lord in all ways for the change that happened. And I believe regardless of the state that you're in, regardless of who you see yourself as now, right? Imagine how Paul saw himself. Regardless of who you see yourself as, whether you feel like a failure, whether you've been abused, rejected, whatever, whether you're in a gang, whatever it is, you can find freedom and restoration in Christ. And that's my message for you guys today. Until next time.